Welcome to the webinar. My name is Elissa Tucker. I head up the Human Capital Management Research Area at APQC. Today's webinar is the second in a three-part series in which we're sharing the results of APQC's survey on the current state of learning and development in organizations today. The survey, which was fielded in 2023, collected data about learning and development drivers, practices, and outcomes. 300 learning and development leaders from across the globe and across industries participated in our survey. And their submissions also represented a range of organization sizes in terms of both headcount as well as revenue. So our first webinar in this series focused on learning and development spending and staffing. And we'll share a link in a moment through the chat feature where you can access that recording and those slides. And I'm going to do a quick recap in a moment just to set the stage for today. Then today we will focus on learning and development practices, programs, and technologies. And then on May 8th, we will have a webinar where we will look at how organizations are measuring learning and the impact of learning on employee and business outcomes. So as I mentioned, I want to start off with a brief recap before we jump in to the topic of today, which is learning and development practices, programs, and technologies. And as I present, I'm going to share with you some of my initial thoughts on these findings, and I invite you to share yours via Zoom's chat feature. And I see many of you are comfortable with the chat feature. Thank you so much for sharing where you're joining us from today. I saw someone note that it's snowy in Chicago. I'm originally from Chicago, and I'm happy that I'm not in the snow. I'm sorry. Maybe you love snow though. We will also have some time at the end of the webinar for you to share comments and to ask questions. And then I do want to add that this is the first look at these survey results, and we're currently in the midst of a more advanced analysis of the results where we're looking to get some prescriptive guidance that can help organizations optimize learning and development. So there's definitely more to come in addition to the May 8th webinar. So before we jump in, I do want to clarify how we defined learning and development. For the purposes of our survey, it includes onboarding, performance management, career development, and training and development. And this definition aligns with APQC's process classification framework, which we call the PCF for short. The PCF is a taxonomy of business processes. Section 7.0 of the PCF is a taxonomy of human capital management processes. And I have included a link to the PCF if you would like to see that at the end of this slide deck. And all attendees and registrants will receive a copy of these slides. So a quick recap. During our last webinar, we saw that 96% of employers increased learning and development spending over the past 12 months, investing a median of $1,095 per employee on learning and development during this timeframe. Roughly 1/3 of this learning and development spending was allocated to learning and development technologies. Then we also saw that 95% of organizations increased learning and development staffing over the past 12 months. The median is 261 employees per learning and development FTE. And FTE stands for full-time equivalent employee. So learning leaders identified for us some of the top drivers behind their increases in learning spending and staffing. And some of these are business productivity and technology goals, skills gaps, and competitive labor markets. And as I think I mentioned earlier, there'll be a link where you can access that webinar at the end of this slide deck. Okay, so let's turn and talk specifically about learning and development practices and programs that these increased learning and development budgets and staff are supporting. So, to start out, let's talk about how much learning organizations are providing for employees. So, how many learning days does your organization provide per employee per year on average? If you're willing and able, please share with us in the chat. I'm also going to share with you what our survey results found, which is that at the median, organizations provided 6 learning days per employee over the past 12 months. And we saw that an organization at the 75th percentile provides 8 learning days per employee per year, where an organization at the 25th percentile provides 4 learning days per employee per year. And I see, thank you so much, Betty Lynn, for sharing. A minimum of 5. Looks like you're right in there. Thank you so much for sharing. So this is roughly how much time employees are spending on employer-provided learning. I want to look at how organizations know what kinds of learning employees need. So there are a variety of methods that can be used to identify and then to prioritize learning needs. For our survey respondents, the most common methods for identifying learning needs are requests made by HR and employee assessment results. Then, when it comes to deciding which learning needs will be prioritized and fulfilled, our survey respondents' top considerations are the availability of these skills, the needed skills, in the external labor market. So, whether or not the needed skill is not only available in the external labor market, but available at a reasonable price point, for example. Then the business criticality of the affected roles, the availability of funds in the learning budget, and then the urgency of the needs. So, for example, whether or not there's enough time to develop that capability in-house. So, after identifying and prioritizing learning needs, an organization needs to select methods for learning delivery. So let's look at the common types of learning and development programs that our survey respondents are using. So the formal learning programs that are most commonly offered by our survey responses are listed on this slide, and they're leadership development, mentoring, upskilling programs, internships, manager supervisor development, and certifications and recertifications. So less commonly offered are formal cross-training, internal talent sharing, reskilling, and coaching programs. Each of these are used by fewer than 40% of organizations. So reskilling is something that we hear a lot about right now, especially in conjunction with generative AI. Generative AI is anticipated to replace certain jobs and to give rise to entirely new roles. So reskilling is an approach that employers can use to prepare those employees whose roles are becoming obsolete to take on new or different positions in the organization. And we recently published an article on Human Resource Executives website that talks about reskilling, and I've included a link to that article at the end of the slide deck if you're interested in learning more. So having a formal reskilling program helps ensure that there's necessary lead time, that there's cross-enterprise coordination, and employee communications, which are all needed to make a reskilling effort successful. Now, coaching is something that we hear a lot about in conjunction with performance management as well as career development. For a number of years, we've seen a trend where organizations are decreasing emphasis from once-a-year backward-looking performance reviews, and they're increasing emphasis on managers and employees having regular forward-looking growth and development conversations. Now, the shift requires that managers hone coaching skills. Having a formal coaching program, the formal, I think, is key here, helps ensure that coaching occurs consistently and where it's needed, It also makes it more likely that managers will receive training as well as access to resources that can help them to be effective coaches. So, formal learning programs are just one way, albeit a major way, to deliver learning and development. Let's talk about other approaches that we see employers using to support or to complement learning and development. So there are a variety of tools that organizations can use to support or complement formal learning and development. This slide lists from most to least common the approaches that we asked about on our survey. As you can see, we asked about a variety of knowledge management practices that can be used to support learning and development. So, what we asked about knowledge transfer, expertise location, knowledge capture, as well as communities practice. These approaches can be particularly effective for delivering organization specific learning. And while, as you can see on the slide, most of these approaches are in the top half of the list in terms of usage, still we saw that fewer than half of organizations use any one of these KM approaches, at least for learning and development purposes. So I think that's an opportunity for many organizations. And learning paths. Are one of the more commonly offered approaches. These are roadmaps that align employee learning goals with appropriate learning opportunities. And they're offered by 43% of organizations. Then I read a lot about the benefits of simulation and gamification in the context of learning. But we saw in our survey that each of these is used by fewer than one-third of organizations to support learning and development. So simulation, for example, is thought to provide employees with hands-on experience. It puts a learner or a group of learners through a dry run of a real work activity. Gamification, which can be a component of simulation, can be used to inject fun competition into a learning experience or activity. So both simulation and gamification can make learning more engaging and more memorable. So I was thinking about, why are these less commonly used? Because there definitely are clear benefits. A couple of thoughts that I had, and feel free to share more on your end from your experiences. But the design of simulations and gamifications just may be too much of an investment of time, money for an organization or for certain types of learning. And then perhaps organizations look at these simulation and gamification approaches as a nice to have rather than a need to have in terms of approaches for achieving their learning objectives. So in addition to these approaches, formal learning programs can also be supported or complemented by talent management practices. So let's turn and look at what we learned about the use of talent management in relation to learning and development. So talent management involves all the processes and activities that an organization performs to recruit, to develop, and to retain talent. Talent management approaches can inform employees about and guide employees through learning and development opportunities. And then they can support employees in finding new projects and new roles in which they can apply their learning. So this kind of application is really critical to ensuring that learning sticks. And then in turn, as a result, that both employees and employers really generate that full value from the investment that they have made in that learning. So on this slide, we have listed the talent management approaches that are most commonly used by our survey respondents to support learning and development. And these are skills assessments, individual development plans, skills profiles, internal recruiting and hiring, talent reviews, and career paths. And I want to talk about a couple of these for a moment. So for me, career paths are of note because they can help empower employees to take charge of their own learning and development. um, I do want to note that a fair amount of design work is required to put formal career paths in place, and also that having a larger number of employees, as well as a varied set of roles within your organizations, makes career paths more reasonable in practice. So while this is a very useful practice in conjunction with learning and development, career paths, are more difficult, I think, to construct if you're in a smaller or a flatter organization. Then I also wanted to talk about some of the talent management approaches that we saw less commonly used with L&D. And these include skills taxonomies, development conversations, and career coaching. So in my conversations with HR and business leaders, skills taxonomies is a topic of increasing interest. It's definitely one of the topics that comes up most frequently in my conversations these days. So skills taxonomies are frameworks that identify and define common skills that are used throughout an enterprise. They provide a consistent language that can be used to connect, to integrate, and to coordinate learning and talent management programs. So, for example, tying together skills assessments with learning and career paths, with performance management, and then with succession planning. Skills taxonomies, however, are difficult to keep current in today's fast-changing business environment, which I think is why I'm hearing them talked about a lot in my conversations, because organizations are struggling with this. And I think it's also why fewer organizations are reporting in our survey right now that they're using skills taxonomies in support of learning and development. So increasingly, technology, whether it's developed in-house or whether it's accessed via an external vendor, will make skills taxonomies more practical to maintain. So I suspect that the next time around, when we field this survey, we will see an increase in the use of skills taxonomies. So as with skills taxonomies, many learning and talent management approaches that we've been talking about today either are or can be supported with learning technologies. So let's look at what our survey showed in terms of how organizations are using technology to support learning programs and practices. So we asked the survey respondents which technologies they're using and to what extent. So the most common technologies that organizations have fully implemented are work tools that allow employees to access learning. So an example would be Microsoft Teams, learning portals through which learning resources can be stored and accessed, learning management systems, which manage learning administration, so scheduling, reporting, and then mobile learning platforms, which enable learning resources to be accessed on a mobile device, such as a cell phone or a tablet computer. Now, among the least common technologies that have been fully implemented are AI-driven learning platforms, learning experience platforms, and augmented reality. So we saw that 38% of organizations in our survey have fully implemented a learning experience platform, and 45% are piloting or rolling one out. A learning experience platform improves the learner experience by, for example, making content easy to find and providing content recommendations. Then we saw that 8% of organizations are using an AI-driven learning platform, and that 29% are piloting or rolling one out. So artificial intelligence refers to computer capabilities that can learn, solve problems, and adapt through perception of their environment. An AI-driven learning platform uses AI to enable learning by, for example, curating content, adapting to individual learner preferences and needs, and automating tasks, for example. And then 5% of organizations are using augmented reality in learning and development, and 18% are piloting or rolling it out. Augmented reality superimposes computer-generated visual or virtual elements on the user's real-world work environment. So with AI being a hot topic these days, I want to look more specifically at how organizations are using AI-driven learning platforms. So among those organizations that are at least piloting AI in learning development, the most common uses that we heard about through our survey are to assess learner capabilities, to personalize learning and development according to learner preferences and needs, and to track learning activities and outcomes. And as we talked about earlier, generative AI is anticipated to change how work is performed. So as such, it will change learning and development. Generative AI is a type of AI that can learn from data and use it to create brand new, unique artifacts. So images, code, video, processes, applications, among other things. In the context of learning and development, some of the ways that AI might be applied include identifying organizational capability gaps and then recommending approaches for addressing these. It could be used to create and to customize learning content to learner preferences and needs. It could be used for delivering learning in a more personalized and dynamic way. So maybe a two-way conversation with a chatbot, for example. It could be used to provide career coaching. So it could take that role of managers and maybe be a career coach for individual employees. And then identifying and recommending options for applying learning, which is something that can be really difficult. So that would be wonderful if AI could identify those within a broader organization and help with some of that matching. So what ways do you see AI, or generative AI, I should say, impacting L&D at your organization, either currently or in the future? Feel free to share that with us in the chat feature. And I do want to share that we will have a study in the second half of this year that is going to look at AI in the use of across use of generative AI and other technologies across all of HR and human capital management. And so there will also be some more of a deep dive into the role of AI in conjunction with learning and development. So that is coming up. So this brings me to the end of my prepared presentation. If you haven't already done so, please just take a moment and submit any questions or any comments that you would like addressed. And while we wait and give you a moment to do that, I want to call out resources that you can use to learn more. APQC members can learn more from the resources in our current state of learning and development content collection. And on this slide, we also have a link where you can use to register for our May 8th webinar, which will be on measuring learning and development effectiveness and impact. Something that is not easy. So we'll talk about what organizations are doing right now and what they feel that they are having success with on that webinar. So I hope you'll register and join us. So now I'm going to take a look at questions and comments that you have shared. Okay. So one question was, does APQC's definition of learning and development include on-the-job training and compliance training? Yes, it does. And then this individual said, curious if how you would remove non-professional development training from some of the metrics. So we, as a benchmarking organization at APQC, have very specific definitions that are used with our assessments to collect this data. And we have a benchmarking team that works with those who fill out our assessments to make these determinations. Often, though, there is a best estimate element that comes into play as well. So that's how they deal with that. Okay. So yes, we are going to share the slides and the recording. You'll receive those via email within 2 business days. I'm just checking out some of the other comments. It looks like you've been networking and answering questions on your own. I'm just going to ask my colleague Megan if there are any questions that are in the chat feature specifically for me to address. Would you mind putting them in our Q&A or sending me a message? I just want to make sure I'm not missing any important things.
Elissa, we had one question earlier on from Claudia saying we're aiming at microlearning shorter, more relevant, so the number of days should decrease, and that is a good thing. But what do you think? What are your thoughts on decreasing number of days by having a more precise program in place?
So it depends. Formal, learning days really refer to, having a formal program and structured approach. So for example, for micro learning, that could be a structured program, but it is, as you recognize, more difficult to collect that data on how much time employees are spending on micro learning. And our advice definitely when we talk about benchmarking number of days of learning is those benchmarks are there to kind of give you one idea of where you as an organization sit potentially against other organizations that are in your industry or with which you compete for talent. And so that's useful information, but it's really important to also consider what is your human capital strategy? What is your learning and development approach? And if you are moving towards less formal approaches, that might factor into how you evaluate those measures, and then it becomes a conversation. How do you talk about that with your leadership? And often we talk to organizations about that. How do you explain to your leadership that maybe your number of learning days is going down, but that is okay, and here's why. And I will also say in our survey report, we do have a little bit more data, and we're actually doing more analysis on this, looking at formal learning programs. So there's a little bit more detail in that collection that I shared there. Megan, anything else?
Just wanted to weigh in on Christina's question on if e-learning type of courses could count as learning programs when they have these available to employees, but they may not always know which courses they're able to take. And my feedback to her in the chat was, it sounds like they do, but then maybe they need to work on some communication. And I know that's kind of key into establishing that to make sure employees know what's available and expected of them. But just if you had any other insight on if e-learning was the formal structured strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your organization. I think it definitely typically is. If it is e-learning that's being accessed via, for example, your learning portal and being directed, by employees, they may have choice in what programs they take, but it's something that you're putting together as part of your full learning package that you're presenting to employees. And in that case, yes, it is definitely part of your formal learning. And hopefully with technology, our ability to measure and track that will get better. And we also see organizations working with having employees keep up-to-date skill and capability competency profiles. And so that can also be another way to keep track of that formal e-learning so that you can, really get a closer to a true figure in terms of how much learning you're providing employees. So we are at time. So I just want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. You will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording. I would like to ask everyone to take the survey. Let us know your feedback on today's webinar so we can incorporate that and make our next one on May 8th even better. I do want to remind everyone that our APQC conference is just around the corner, a wonderful networking and learning opportunity. Check this link out on the slide to learn more and connect with APQC on social. And here's my email as well as my LinkedIn information. So if you have further questions or comments, thoughts about this research, I'd love to hear them. So please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for your time today.